Formula One's much vaunted rules revolution for 2022 is all about improving what Ross Brawn has called the raceability of Grand Prix cars. This has led to arguably the biggest overhaul of the aerodynamic rules in F1 history, with the aim of allowing cars to race harder and closer than in recent times. It's inevitable that the effectiveness of the rule changes will be the biggest talking point of the early races of 2022. But there is another factor beyond the technical regulations that will play a huge part in whether the new look cars, with their greater reliance on ground effect aerodynamics, are considered a success or failure. And that is nothing to do with those who wrote the regulations or who are working hard to design the 2022 cars, but instead it's all down to Pirelli and whether it can meet the tough targets it has been set by Formula One. Let us know in the comments how high your hopes are for better racing in Formula One with the new regulations in 2022. From 2019 to 2021, Formula One has used Pirelli tyres that have been largely the same, save for some small tweaks along the way to make the construction more robust, most recently with the changes to the rear tyres introduced at the British Grand Prix. But next year, Pirelli will introduce an all-new range of low-profile F1 tyres for the switch from 13 to 18-inch wheel rims. The development process for these tyres stretches all the way back to 2014, when Lotus reserve driver Charles Pic trialled very early prototype tyres at Silverstone. This was at a time when there was an active plan that never came off to switch to such tyres, so the track testing programme for the change in 2022 only started in earnest in September 2019. Initially, this was for introduction in 2021, only for the new rules to be put back by a year in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The testing has been done using F1 mule cars provided by teams, designed to simulate the anticipated downforce levels and pace of the 2022 cars. The construction of the tyres is due to be homologated at the start of September, and the compounds will be locked in shortly afterwards. Pirelli has already largely finalised the construction and compounds for the lower profile tyres. Inevitably, these will have very different characteristics in terms of their stiffness and the way they interact with the suspension system of F1 cars. This is particularly important because the tyres themselves are effectively part of the suspension system, with the low profile tyres having stiffer sidewalls than the current ones. As there are also changes to the suspension regulations in 2022, the way the tyres are loaded will be slightly different to the way they are on the mule cars. But the key targets Pirelli has been set are all about the wider characteristics of the tyres. The requirements are laid out in what's known as the target letter, which stipulates the characteristics F1, the FIA, the teams and drivers want from Pirelli's tyres. And how well Pirelli meets these targets is critical to the success of the 2022 regulations. There are three key objectives listed as the main priorities in the target letter. The first is to reduce the overheating problems that have made the tyres so sensitive in recent times. This is one of the key reasons why drivers struggle to follow rivals closely, as they quickly overheat the surface of the tyres and lose grip. This also accelerates the thermal degradation of the tyres and contributes to the traffic jams that build up at the end of preparation laps in qualifying. If the tyre overheating problems are reduced, drivers will be able to push harder and also suffer less when chasing a rival, because the temperature spikes when the tyre slides across the track surface will be mitigated. If this objective is not met, then even if the aerodynamic turbulence is reduced by the new rules, then the overheating problems will make it more difficult to overtake. But it's important to note that if the regulations do tidy up the aerodynamic wake as expected, this will mean less downforce is lost, and should also mean there is less sliding around on the tyres, so it's a virtuous circle. F1's analysis indicates that the current cars drop to 55% of their downforce levels when a car's length behind a rival, but this figure will be 86% under the new rules. Even though it's expected that the final figure will fall somewhere in between those two, as after all the laws of physics are immutable and teams will design more complex cars than perhaps the rule makers anticipate, this will be a big improvement and should make life easier for the tyres. The second priority in the target letter is to have a wider working range in terms of temperatures. While there will always be a relatively narrow peak where the grip of the tyres is maximised, teams and drivers have long complained about how narrow the window of the Pirellis is. If the window is wider, the challenge of switching on the tyres will be reduced and drivers will have to do less management of them, both over stints and qualifying laps. The combination of this and more stable surface temperatures should allow drivers to push harder for longer and race more aggressively, rather than being contained by the limitations of the tyres. The third priority is to have progressive degradation in terms of the grip of the tyres over their lives, along with the right performance deltas between the compounds used to maximise strategic variety. It's hoped that this will ensure all 3 available compounds on a race weekend are usable for the race and allow a mix of 1, 2 and 3 stop strategies. Again, this objective will also be helped if the aerodynamic rules work as hoped and overtaking is more straightforward, as it could therefore make it easier to make a faster strategy with more stops work, whereas currently, the less stops the better. There are other objectives in the target letter, but these are the more technical targets related to characteristics such as the stiffness, the balance of the new tyres, but the 3 main priorities are the key ones that Pirelli must deliver on to avoid undermining the objectives of the 2022 regulations. Pirelli is very positive about the progress it has made with the 2022 tyres, although to this we have to add several caveats. The testing has been done using cars that are only an approximation of next year's. While they are reckoned to be closer to the performance and downforce levels of the real 2022 cars than the mule cars that were used by Pirelli to develop the tyres for the high downforce rule changes of 2017, which is inevitable given they were having to add downforce to cars that are already maxed out for that development programme, whereas downforce levels might be a little bit lower next year, they cannot be an exact match. Secondly, it won't be until we see the 2022 tyres used in anger in racing situations that we can evaluate how successfully Pirelli has achieved its objectives. But there will be some hints before then. There'll be a tyre test held after the season-ending Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, where all teams, save for Williams, which has not produced a mule car, will be able to run together on the final specification of the tyres. This will offer the chance to evaluate how temperature sensitive the tyres are in turbulence, something Pirelli hasn't yet been able to check, albeit with cars that aerodynamically create more turbulence than next year's are expected to. There is also the scope to make modifications to the tyres based on what is learned in that test, even though the tyres will have been homologated by then. If there are any problems that need fixing, they need to be addressed then, as pre-season will be too late to make changes given the manufacturing requirements for the early races of the season. There are good reasons to expect the tyres to be a good step forward next year. The lower profile tyres will be stiffer, meaning they should be less prone to failure and more stable in terms of pressures. But whether or not they deliver on the key targets of being less temperature sensitive, having a wider operating window and with rates of degradation and performance deltas that make for strategic variety, only time will tell. What's clear is that it's very important. After all, it's the 4 tyres that attach the car to the ground. The drivers have collectively pushed very hard for this and have helped to frame the objectives in the target letter, as they found the need to manage the tyres so aggressively since Pirelli became F1's controlled tyre supplier in 2011 frustrating. Inevitably, there is some scepticism about whether Pirelli can really deliver tyres that fit the bill, although the feedback from the drivers who have tested the tyres for 18-inch wheel rims so far has been gently positive. It's also important to bear in mind that Pirelli has always been limited by testing restrictions, as well as the fact that the tyres are a very easy thing to blame for teams and drivers when things go wrong. But the development process for the new Pirellis has been long and more rigorous than in the past, meaning there is hope that the all-important tyres will play their part in making the 2022 regulations a success. And if there are problems, we can be sure that the teams and drivers will make their feelings very clear. So are you convinced by Pirelli's confidence? Let us know if you are, or if you still have doubts, in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this look at Pirelli's role in F1's 2022 revolution, make sure you hit like and subscribe.